Hi, my name is Jeremy Klass. I am the Natural and Working Lands Coordinator here with the State of New Mexico Forestry Division. And as part of the National Association of State Foresters, I've been invited to speak with you all about forest carbon and talk about current marketing programs, project developers, and opportunities moving forward. First, just want to address carbon markets and provide a brief overview about what this is all based on. And when we really look at a carbon offset framework, we're really talking about sequestration. And at the basis, sequestration is the removal of atmospheric CO2 by plants via photosynthesis, converting the carbon into food, energy, biomass, and where carbon also makes its way into soil through the releases of carbon from roots, as well as decay and decomposition. When carbon gets tied up in the leaves, wood, soils, soil microbes, etc., the carbon is said to be sequestered and thus completely removed from the atmosphere. Sustainable management practices can help increase the capacity of natural ecosystems like forests sequester more carbon. Also, these sustainable management practices can help to increase the capacity of working systems like agriculture and rangelands sequester more carbon as well. And when we talk about a carbon offset, it is really an instrument representing the reduction, avoidance, or sequestration of 1 metric ton of CO2 or greenhouse gas equivalent. And a carbon market revolves around carbon offsets or credits generated by carbon emission reduction practices. An entity that either lowers their own carbon emissions or captures carbon through sequestration practices produces a carbon credit and can sell this credit to a buyer, therefore setting up a market. The transaction of carbon credits on this market allows for a buyer to use the purchase credit to reduce their own carbon emission. So what is the prevalence of carbon markets currently? Current activities across the country are highly varied and exploratory. However, they are being established at great haste. State forestry agencies have almost universally been in a supporting role to other organizations. A few states were prominently involved early on in the carbon market development, but definitely have stepped back when organized exchanges failed to be sustainable. Some states have been involved in registering state-owned lands, but most states really have no substantive program for helping landowners sell carbon offsets. When we talk about carbon markets, there's really 2 forms of these carbon markets. One is the voluntary, and the other is regulatory or compliance. When we talk about the voluntary market side of things, this really enables companies and individuals to purchase carbon offsets on a voluntary basis with no intended use for compliance. And this really is all driven by corporate or social responsibility, an ethical, reputational, or supply chain risk, and it's really also used as pre-regulation. So it actually establishes some sort of market system and kind of outlines the whole methodology behind it and kind of helps a company deal with any sort of regulations that may be coming in the future. Also, voluntary markets are more flexible and innovative, where finance monitoring methodologies are allowed to flourish, kind of like a capitalistic system. And so, for example, the voluntary carbon market has spawned its own standards, registries, and product types beyond the scope of existing compliance market mechanisms. In recent years, governments worldwide have increasingly turned to voluntary carbon market mechanisms, particularly standards and registries, to inform the development of or serve as compliance instruments themselves. So if we switch to the other form in the regulatory sort of compliance market system, it's really created and regulated by mandatory national, regional, or international reduction regimes. It's really designating economic sectors to fit under some sort of cap. And so that really brings us to, there's kind of 2 sort of regulatory or compliance mechanisms that are used within the regulatory carbon market. That is either a carbon tax or a cap and trade system. A carbon tax is the price, or sets the price of carbon dioxide emissions and allows the market to determine the quantity of emission reductions. Companies are charged a dollar amount for every ton of emissions they produce. A cap and trade system really sets the quantity of emissions reductions and lets the market determine the price. These allowances can be auctioned to the highest bidder as well as traded on secondary markets. Right now, currently, there are two primary regulatory markets in the United States for forest carbon offsets. These are the California Cap and Trade System and the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Eastern US, or RGGI. Some kind of states and regions are being subjected to some sort of regulatory or compliance carbon market. So for example, there is a pending compliance market program set to begin in the state of Washington, and that's going to commence in 2023. And that came out of the Climate Commitment Act. The state of Massachusetts has two separate compliance programs currently to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And they are part of the RGGI, but they also have a separate parallel program aimed at reducing CO2 emissions from electricity generating facilities. Oregon also is proposed to have some sort of regulatory compliance market system, and that's slated to be started in 2022. And there is a Transportation and Climate Program, or TCI-P, proposed to start in 2022 on the eastern side, the eastern regional aspect of things in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island are all going to be part of that particular market system. So let's switch gears real quick and really talk about the state of the regulatory market. And the legislature is moving with haste under the bipartisan growing climate solutions. And so this is at the national level. As it is proposed, this looks to be sort of a hybrid approach where the USDA is going to kind of assess the market for carbon credits. And that's really going to be taking cues from the voluntary market. They will help to establish a third-party certification program and with an advisory council. And so this is really kind of regulating the process. And so this is where I'm talking about sort of this hybrid kind of system where the actual verification and methodologies associated with these providers will actually be sort of regulated or at least advised and be verified by the USDA at the federal level. This will also establish an online web portal to where information and sort of a market overview can be obtained by anybody and everybody. And they will plan on reporting to Congress regularly on the market performance, the challenges and the barriers that individuals are facing or entities that are facing in joining this regulatory market. But really, when it boils down to it, there's really going to be a set of policy tools to direct funding to incentivize voluntary climate mitigation. And within the Growing Climate Solutions Act, there is going to be an initial $4.1 million allocated that will be supplemented with a $1 million per year for the next 5 years. And the Senate Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry Committee has already passed the bill. This has already moved through the Senate and is now being introduced into the House. Just to kind of a side note, there is also the Rural Forest Markets Act, and that's moving through Congress itself right now. It is a bipartisan bill that would help small-scale private forest landowners by guaranteeing financing for markets for forest carbon reduction practices. So what is the current state of the voluntary market? And there are an increasingly large number of forest carbon opportunities in the voluntary market. Nearly all the forest carbon offsets in the US right now are enrolled in one of 3 primary carbon registries. This is the Climate Action Reserve, the American Carbon Registry, and the Vera Registry System. And we've provided links here for anybody and everybody to go and actually get some more information from these. As noted earlier, that state forestry has really provided sort of a supplementary role. And so these are in working partnerships within the forest carbon space. And so oftentimes these partnerships are formed between state forestries and the most prominent NGOs working in the foreign carbon space. And that's really the American Forest Foundation and the Nature Conservancy. And so the American Forest Foundation and TNC have teamed up to start the Family Forest Program, in which these two NGOs serve as aggregators in the voluntary market to get more landowner participation. Several states have been working with for-profit organizations, specifically one formerly called Silva Terra, now it's called NCX. They are working on creating their own marketplace for connecting interested buyers and sellers of forest carbon and helping to address the market barriers for small landowners. States also report working with several other for-profit carbon project developers. And just for example, these are entities like Terra Carbon, Finite Carbon, and Acre Investment and Management, LLC. Where do states currently stand on private lands? And so some states have taken an active role in carbon project development on private lands. So for example, in Hawaii, a group reforestation carbon project is being developed through the Division of Forestry and Wildlife. It is officially certified when they will be able to enroll other similar reforestation projects, including both public and private lands across the state of Hawaii every time there's a verification completed or the issuance of credits. And right now that the minimum frequency is at 5 years. And so the Division of Forestry and Wildlife is certifying its own forest carbon project with Verra through their verified carbon standard and climate, community, and biodiversity standards. In Virginia, as part of the Healthy Watersheds Forest Retention Program for the Chesapeake Bay, the State Forestry Agency is working with 2 localities to develop the legal documents and a framework to begin landscape scale aggregation of carbon as a proxy for forest land retention and water quality improvement, and to achieve the goals in the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Implementation Plan. Where are states currently on state-owned land? So some states have investigated and even enrolled state forested lands in carbon offset programs. So for example, Tennessee and Michigan are currently in an exploratory phase of forest carbon on public lands. This will definitely be, the enrollment of state lands will undoubtedly be assessed with more federal policy actions, especially with the climate bill that's moving through the House right now, but also the implementation of the 30 by 30 program and the initiative at the federal side of things. I think an interesting caveat here to talk about, just when we're talking about state-owned lands and how they may be involved in a registry or a carbon market itself, I think we need to talk about and think about how profits, when they come from these state-owned lands involved in these carbon markets, and we actually have profits generated from the enrollment of those lands into a market-based system, we need to understand where that money goes, or at least think about where that money goes and what the legal ramifications are associated with the enrollment of those state lands in these programs. Undoubtedly, policy and regulations will be needed and legislative direction will be required. And so I think as we move through this whole process, stay tuned, and we should get some more direction at not the federal level, but also the state level. I think it's important to outline that some states have resources and authorities which are vestiges of previous policy and interests in forest carbon, but they are no longer, they're not in use right now. They never really were put in use, but could prove integral in future policy developments. And so some examples are the Oregon Department of Forestry having the statutory authority to create a carbon offset program, which would be available specifically for forest carbon, but which has never been created. And in Georgia, the Warnell School of Forestry at UGA helped create carbon sequestration tables, and Georgia Forestry Commission provided initial training for consulting foresters that wanted to inventory projects. However, as market interest has waned, the information has become out of date and the registry never got much use. So I think there's also the instance where carbon credits may actually only be thought of as being focused on natural systems or rural areas, but carbon credit programs are not solely focused on those sort of systems, and city forest carbon credits are actually becoming a thing. And so city forest carbon credits is a partnership itself between the city of Austin and tree folks to generate carbon credits to enhance urban tree canopies. And there are other emerging markets and opportunities that are within the urban forest space. Really, all of these nonprofit organizations seek to promote the inclusion of urban landscapes into market-based systems and to promote green spaces in US cities. And just for example, we've provided just 3 examples and their websites to actually go and look at sort of what these systems and what these opportunities look like within the urban space. And then we also, as state foresters, we also have to think about the federal side of things. And so where do carbon markets stand there? Right now, the National Forest Foundation, the NFF, is the congressionally centered and chartered nonprofit partner of the US Forest Service. They have actually set up a carbon capital fund that provides conservation donors a way to offset their personal emissions, where contributions are used for reforestation projects on national forests. These projects result in a measured, independently verified, and registered carbon benefit. And I think it's interesting, you can go and explore some of the carbon inventory methods and some of the management, as well as the reporting that USFS has kind of outlined that it puts into this carbon capital fund, and actually look and get some ideas about what might be implemented at the federal level, especially when regulations in the regulated carbon market may be a thing that we actually will observe and be part of and be participating in the future. And so with that, I want to thank you. I've left my contact information, so if there are any questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out, and I'd love to talk. Thank you.